Um, Thank you, everybody, for joining us here today. It's my pleasure to kick off the 2021 series of Wagner Society webinars for the time being. And, you know, the outlook doesn't really look good for meeting in person anytime soon. So we'll keep doing this because it's been really great. It's been an opportunity for us to reach out to a larger audience, more than double what we would have in an in-person audience. So that's really great. And we are proud to be doing that. We're inviting people in from other Wagner societies all over the world. I think we have Australia, New Zealand, we've got the UK, Mexico, we have someone from, well, UK, okay. Scotland, are you still in the UK or not, or did you Brexit? I haven't managed to stay up on the politics of what's going on over there. It's been a little busy here. So, welcome everyone, and I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted to have these two gentlemen with us here today. I'm going to keep the introduction short because to us here in San Francisco, we really don't need to do much of an introduction for Joshua Kosman, music journalist for the San Francisco Chronicle, covering the San Francisco Chronicle's classical music scene and reviewing and reporting on the wealth of orchestral, chamber, operatic, and contemporary music throughout the Bay Area. And in his spare time, he's a cryptic crossword puzzle master. So thank you for being with us today, Joshua Kosman.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, and then the reason for being here today is Alex Ross, the wonderful author and journalist. If you're like me, you dash to the mailbox to get that New Yorker to see what Alex Ross has written about, either if it's a book or a CD or a video or a live performance. Not so many of those these days. I would always start at the back of the New Yorker and work my way forward if there was an Alex Ross article in there. He's here today because he's written a new, unusual, and definitive book on Wagner, I can say, Wagnerism-Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. His other two books are The Rest is Noise, which I've read cover to cover a number of times, and also Listen to This. And so, I forgot to introduce myself. My name's Terry Stewart. I'm the president of the Wagner Society of Northern California and have been so since for 10 years now, the president, previously serving as treasurers, and I've been orchestrating the programming for, I think it's about 20 years now. So thank you for joining us today. It's our honor to welcome these two wonderful gentlemen. And with that, I'm going to shut my mouth and turn off my microphone, and we've got 105 logons now. So I turn it over to Joshua. Why don't you start out?
Sure. Thanks so much, Terry. Thanks for having me and Alex both, and it's a pleasure to be here. Alex and I, you know, in the before times would see each other periodically at things when things there were, but now it's all like this. It's a great opportunity to connect and to talk about this remarkable book that, oh, it's probably backwards, isn't it? If I do that. This remarkable history of Wagner's influence, which is conceived as a history of Wagner's influence outside of the world of music. So for those of you who haven't read it yet or who are still making through, you'll find that there's relatively little here about Wagner's music and very relatively little about his work compared with the work that he influenced and put his stamp on, and particularly not very much about his influence on the people you might expect us to read about, like Strauss or Mahler or Debussy. And instead, what Alex has done in this remarkable tome is to trace the spread of Wagnerian ideas and models through literature, painting, film, politics, psychoanalysis, so much more. And one of the things he talks about is movies and superhero movies. I personally have very little interest in superhero movies, but I'm always a sucker for a good origin story. So let's start with that. What's the origin story behind Wagnerism? How did the idea come to you, and in what form, to undertaking a project like this?
Well, first of all, thank you so much to the Wagner Society in North Carolina for Did I say North Carolina? It's already off to a bad start. Northern California. I did talk to the Wagner Society of North Carolina. And thank you so much, Josh, for that lovely introduction. It is just great to see you and talk to you from a certain distance. Yeah, no, the book had an inception, I suppose, sort of going all the way back to my earliest encounters with and sort of grapplings with Wagner, especially in college, which is when I really started listening to Wagner seriously, and also kind of immersing myself in this context which forms the heart of the book, the fin de siècle. This was just it's always been my obsession. When I was a teenager, I found Karl Schorsky's Fin de siècle Vienna, classic book, in my high school library, and was just mesmerized by this idea of a city that was somehow cocooned in art, and sort of all the sort of celebrities walking the streets were Schoenberg and Mahler and Klimt and Schnitzler and so on. And just so much of what I've done is when I was in college and then as a writer has revolved around this period. And this was the heyday of Wagnerism. And so part of why writing the book was so attractive to me was I was able to sink myself once more, sort of ever deeper in this period with Wagner as the excuse, as the jumping off point. But really more than that, I think more acutely, the book began when I was working on The Rest is Noise. And I found myself constantly distracted by Wagner and the Wagner question, the Wagner questions. And of course, beginning right in 1900, beginning with Mahler and Strauss, Wagner was already there. We were living in Wagner's shadow. And to make any sense of these composers and Schoenberg and even Stravinsky, everyone else, you had to backtrack and sort of understand what Wagner unleashed in music. But then he kept sort of popping back in. And later in the book, I talked about music in Nazi Germany. And of course, Wagner was inevitably a presence there. But I just found myself distracted by this question of how Wagner affected everything, especially at the fin de siècle, this world. And I couldn't really get into it, in this book, but it's kind of in that book. But it's an interesting sign, I think, when you're immersed in one project and you find yourself making these detours, which may very well point toward your next project. And so I think that was the way it was for me. It just felt natural and inevitable to pick up this strand and talk about Wagner, but now with the question of his overall cultural impact outside of music, and zeroing in on this question of how fin de siècle culture absorbed him and transformed him. And that's really what the book is centrally about.
So you said two different but related things, which is about exploring the aftermath of Wagner and the influence in the shadow and everything downstream from him, but also the decision to say, and you know what else? Let's leave the music aside and do the non-musical part. And what's the relationship between those two focusings?
Well, I think it's an organizing principle in a way. I think if I had talked about the music as well, the book is already quite long and quite dense, and it would have just become either just insanely sprawling, or I would have had to cut way back on this material having to do with Wagner's influence on literature, on the arts, on philosophy and intellectual life in order to make room for the music. And it's been a somewhat controversial decision that I made. It's been commented on in a number of reviews, which I, as a critic, find a slightly annoying way of going about doing criticism. It's something I try to avoid myself, sort of instructing the writer or the performers and sort of what they should have done, in place of what they were actually doing. And say if someone spends 10 years of their life working on a book about the English novel, it just doesn't make very much sense to say, well, what about the French novel? But so it goes. But for me, I mean, this is the heart of the matter. This is what makes Wagnerism, this topic, so interesting and so singular. leave aside the music, see how he leapt outside of this, his own quote unquote realm, and affected so many other disciplines, which in fact ends up saying a lot about Wagner in this kind of retrospective way. This happened with Wagner because Wagner was never merely a composer, as all of you know, and music was just one component of this enormous project that he undertook that goes back to, I think, his childhood, when he was just a kid who loved the idea of the theater and acting and performance and sort of putting on a show, and sort of that's what he did all his life in the very simplest sense. If only it were so simple, putting on a show. And so that goes very far toward explaining why he had this outsized impact. But it hadn't really happened before, and I don't think it's happened since. This phenomenon of Wagner becoming a quasi ill-defined movement across the arts and achieving such a position of prominence that there were very few artists and writers at the turn of the century who didn't feel compelled to deal with him on some level, even if it was by simply rejecting him. He was just this mountain that you could not circumnavigate. You sort of had to sort of get over the Wagner mountain in some way. And so, yeah, it does all kind of tie together. And ultimately, it is a book about Wagner. I mean, I've sort of tried to deny sometimes that it's a book about Wagner, but of course it is. And there is certainly a poorly concealed agenda in the book to expand people's ideas of what Wagner is all about, to complicate people's ideas and to see what we gain from looking at Wagner through so many different eyes and so many brilliant and creative eyes. And then hopefully it does enrich one's understanding of the composer, even for those who, of course, like so many of you, have been immersed in Wagner for so long. It certainly turned out to be that way for me.
So I was looking over my review of this book and found that I had written the phrase, people who had interpreted and misinterpreted his work. And I have no idea what I thought I meant by that. But it seems apropos in the sense that, he creates this body of work and then it goes out into the world and he loses control of it, as all artists do. And that, I think, is always interesting to me about the sort of the spectacle of the slippage, where all the work gets loose and then gets taken up by people who aren't Wagner, but who are Wagnerites or Wagnerians or Wagner worshippers of some kind. And in some cases, it ends up very far from where it began. And I have the sense in reading your book and elsewhere that this process was well in hand before Wagner died, right? I mean, that it's already, all gone loose across Europe and across the world and gotten away from him in some way. How does that process work, is in your view, the sort of the losing control for the creator?
And this is of such interest to me, and it is absolutely at the heart of the book. And I feel that I've now already said a number of different things are at the heart of the book, but this is really it. What happens to art, any work of art, as it enters our lives, as it enters so many different people's lives? What happens to it? How does it change? And what is the history of that sort of transformation through time? Reception, there's a story of reception in the basic sense, but this is a very particular kind of reception. It's not a question of sort of assessing whether an audience sort of liked it or didn't like it, or sort of what the critics said in different places. It is about how the music is received by these enormously creative people who do then transform it and reveal it in a completely different guise. And that is just fascinating. I think you and I, as critics, are constantly aware of the malleability and mutability of musical meaning, and how sort of everyone who goes to a concert is at a different concert, and you were not at the same concert that I was. And so this book is kind of on a very sort of large level studying that phenomenon, and in a way sort of trying to search out, well, what does really still remain that is Wagner, because I don't believe he vanishes completely, in this process. He is still present in all of these relationships, but they're very complex relationships. And yeah, absolutely, he there was already a loss of control well before his death. And of course, when we say control, we have to sort of begin with the reality that Wagner may never have been, I'll go so far as to say he was never in control of his work, in the sense that he knew precisely at any given moment what he was doing and how he wanted it to be understood. And you'd only look at just a smallest portion of his writings to realize that his own conceptions of his work were constantly evolving. They contradict each other. It's this sort of creative chaos of conflicting ideas from which Wagner's work arises. So it was already out of control, before it left Wagner's desk. But once it goes out into the world, there are these moments where it is being wrenched away in some completely new direction. The pivotal moment is, of course, in France in 1861, with the publication of Baudelaire's essay Richard Wagner and Tannhäuser in Paris. There are instances of this diversification of Wagnerian meaning even before that, but Baudelaire is really the first spectacular instance of it, where Baudelaire is just yanking Wagner into his own world and radically revising what Tannhäuser means or seemed to mean to Wagner, Lohengrin, and the other music that he had heard, and just translating it into the milieu of Baudelaire, of the nascent Parisian avant-garde, the sort of literary and visual arts movement leading toward, Impressionism was already underway, but eventually toward symbolism and early modernism. And so Wagner becomes this conduit for otherworldly forces and supernatural forces and decadence and disorder and bohemian energies and the dream state, and you see the beginnings of sort of the stream of consciousness understanding of Wagner and of everything else. And so that's really the flashpoint, and I get to that in chapter 2. Chapter 1 deals really with Wagner himself and the inception of the Ring and the relationship with Nietzsche. And sort of Nietzsche is sort of the other very logical starting point for talking about Wagnerism and the transformation of Wagner in other people's minds. But Baudelaire is just so spectacular. And something that I found so interesting to look at is how Wagner perceived Baudelaire's interpretation of his work. And he wrote 2 letters to Baudelaire when the essay was published, after the essay was published. And the first essay, the first letter, the essay is really mentioned only in passing, and just thank you for your beautiful words. And then Wagner goes off and continues to complain about whatever was sort of obsessing him at the time. And my theory is that, in fact, he had not read the essay at this stage. He merely wanted to acknowledge that and sort of write that hasty note that that we all do, just sort of to make sure that, we don't seem to be ignoring someone. And then he writes a second letter, and he's read the essay now, and he's obviously absolutely sort of thunderstruck by it. And he says, I could never believe that someone could have understood me so well. And I've been sort of looking for you and to personally thank you. And I don't think that this is a sign at all that Wagner thought that Baudelaire had really found his way to the heart of what Wagner perceived to be, what his work was about. What impressed him was the violence of this sort of the personal force of this interpretation, which really meant that his work had leapt into a new sphere, and it was really the guarantee of his his immortality, just that if the work was having such an effect, outside of his own sphere. So the pragmatic kind of market conscious person in him, which was a very substantial part of what Wagner was about, was just excited to see this happening, whether or not what Baudelaire wrote about Wagner made any sense to him whatsoever. There's good reason to believe that a lot of it would have struck him as just sort of crazy nonsense, but that impressed him. And so there's so many other instances of sort of Wagner losing control, of sort of people seizing hold of one aspect or another of his work, the proliferation of this vocabulary and these slogans, which often frustrated Wagner. He was alarmed when the Gesamtkunstwerk concept really started taking off. He wrote to Liszt, genug davon, enough of this, Gesamt. That was a hopeless project of getting that under control. The leitmotif, the artwork of the future, sort of all these Wagnerian buzzwords were proliferating. He was often helpless, to sort of pull them back. But nonetheless, again, the pragmatic Wagner would have recognized, this beast has been, unleashed, and was sort of operating on its own terms and would be understood very differently in different places.
It's also struck me that there are whole generations of followers who, sort of Shanghai his model or his influence for their own purposes, rather in the same way that he did to Beethoven. Sort of doing what he wanted to do and then saying, this has been foreordained by the Ninth Symphony, in that kind of acquisitive backward look, and then to have the same process repeated on him always felt like a sort of form of historical justice to me. I don't know whether you
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, he of course he did this to all his predecessors. So what he did to Meyerbeer, by sort of taking what he needed from Meyerbeer and then brutally assaulting him in the anti-Semitic essay, was what subsequent people would do to Wagner as well. This kind of sort of conquering of Wagner and sort of pillaging of Wagner. It was done to him, and sort of that's really what Nietzsche accomplished, and a number of others after Nietzsche. And there's certainly historical justice in that.
Did you find yourself at all feeling, as you sort of surveyed that history of pillage, did you find yourself sort of issuing judgments and saying, yes, you understand what Wagner is, and then you over there, you're taking Wagner and twisting him to your own, das ist kein Wagner.
Yeah. I was tempted to do that, and I'm sure I did do it in a number of places, but I tried to draw back from that because this was certainly not the point of the book, to sort of go through this mass of reactions to Wagner and select the right ones and reject the quote unquote false ones. The quote unquote false ones, the misreadings, the wild sort of speculative interpretations were often sort of the most interesting aspects of the story. And then sort of much more cautious, correct readings of Wagner were, I think, seldom in league with sort of really interesting creative responses to Wagner. I mean, I did still feel compelled to step in at times, and particularly with the Liebestod idea, which became so enormous and so widespread in turn of the century culture, and the sort of the word Liebestod itself, it's another misnomer that sprouted and sort of Wagner lost control of in his own lifetime. That was Liszt's fault, as I'm sure most of you know.
Do you want to walk us through that for a second?
Yeah. So for Wagner, the word Liebestod, love death, applies to the music that accompanies the drinking of the potion. Which of course you hear in the prelude already, right at the beginning of the prelude, and then is repeated in the first act when the potion is actually drunk. The potion of death that turns into a potion of love. And sort of that is what the music describes. And Wagner's name for the ending of Tristan, Isolde's final monologue, was Isolde's Verklärung, Isolde's transfiguration. But Liszt, when he made a piano transcription, attached the word Liebestod, took it away from the music of the prelude and attached it to the very ending of the opera. And so that music, that monologue at the end, became known as Isolde's Liebestod. And from there, the sort of Liebestod was generally taken to indicate this moment of sort of lovers dying together, a sort of love that is so extreme that it becomes death, and from there you have these sort of increasingly lurid, decadent turn of the century scenarios of lovers committing suicide together, one lover hurling his beloved off a cliff and falling with her, sort of a murder-suicide that happens in D'Annunzio's Triumph of Death, and sort of all these sort of different variations on it. And it is, I think, it feels profoundly wrong to me. I mean, this is not what the ending of Tristan feels as though it is about to me, and it's almost a reversal of what is really happening. Instead of the death that turns into love, it's the love that turns into death. And yet, there are reasons why this happened. And I think I can't deny that there is an enormous romance of death in Tristan. It's really what you find in Romeo and Juliet and sort of some of the other sort of earlier works, but it took on a specific energy, I think, in decadent fin de siècle culture. It becomes something more morbid, more lurid. You can certainly find that energy in Wagner. It's expanded, it's amplified, and sort of that ultimately became, what the opera was thought to be about. And so it's a misreading which has such a kind of cultural center of gravity to it that it's sort of its existence and its influence can't be denied. And perhaps still, misreading, misinterpretation. As you said, sort of looking back at your own review, it's, well, ultimately, it's a tricky word to apply with an artist as multivarious and in some ways unknowable as Wagner.
I was interested. I don't know whether. I mean, it was interested that Harold Bloom's name didn't come up in the course of this book. Maybe we don't read much of Harold Bloom anymore. Or maybe he didn't.
I certainly talk about him in the book. I mean, I talk about him at the beginning.
All right.
And it's a very important this idea of anxiety of influence, which is a theory that Bloom, as I think he admitted in many ways, derived from Nietzsche, because of Nietzsche talked about the agon, this smackdown, this sort of bloody struggle between artists, especially between sort of the younger artist and the older artist, and sort of the need for the younger artist to displace the genius of the day. First of all, just because, as Nietzsche conceived it, sort of looking at sort of this ancient Greek frame, no one should be dominant. There should be no one genius. So that sort of dominant figure must be displaced for the health of an artistic community. And of course, it's also sort of self-serving, in that you need to sort of push away the previous genius in order to make room for the new genius, namely Nietzsche. And so it's even the idea of the anxiety of influence, I think, derives to some extent from Wagner, and specifically from sort of Nietzsche's relationship with Wagner. So sort of this master example of how this charged relationship of influence works. And there's so many other interesting examples of it in the Wagner story, sort of the Wagnerism story.
So there are some interesting parts in this book. Many of them are sort of the points where you touch on the subjects that one would expect to see, and then there are other things where there are other figures in the book who take on a sort of an outsized importance, at least relative to my own expectations. I certainly was not. I did not have, thousands of words on Willa Cather on my bingo card. I know you enough to know that Thomas Mann was going to be a regular visitor. I didn't quite anticipate how frequent he was going to be. He sort of shows up. He's always sort of lurking around the far corner there. And I'm curious, as you were kind of putting this all together and shaping it, was there some way in which you said, well, now is a chance to really, do my Willa Cather dance. This is the excuse I needed or was it a matter of like, no, you can't tell the story of Wagnerism without Willa Cather. That's just, how much of this was, I guess what I'm asking is how much of this was optional in your view, and how much of it was, this is a forced move?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. And I think there are certainly cases in the book where I was just waiting for my opportunity to sort of unload everything I've been thinking about. I think Joyce is probably the main example, where I studied Joyce in college. I wrote this convoluted post-structuralist senior thesis on Joyce, and that was sort of really my central concern as an English major. And so I had this backlog of stuff that I wanted to say about Joyce. And sort of this was going to be my big chance. And I don't think it's particularly forced, because I think the relationship between Joyce and Wagner is a rich one, rich enough for Timothy Martin to have written an entire book on the subject, Joyce and Wagner. And so there's sort of more than enough to be said there. There's sort of maybe other instances where I was sort of smuggling in a favorite author or a favorite artist on perhaps a slightly stretched pretext. Henry James, it's James really didn't give much evidence of thinking too much about Wagner, but I just couldn't resist including The Wings of the Dove and the Venetian scenes of The Wings of the Dove in the section on death in Venice, and sort of this question of particularly gay Wagnerians and in Venice, which is, there were sort of a number of them, but of course Thomas Mann was the main one. And with the case of Cather, though, this was not part of my grand plan setting out. And in fact, really more than 10 years ago, when I started working on this book, I would not at all have described myself as a Catherite. She's been a sort of more recent discovery for me, and really because of this book, I think. I delved into Cather. I mean, I knew that she was going to be part of it. Song of the Lark is just one of the great novels about really sort of centered on Wagner as a topic in terms of being a biography of a Wagner singer. And then I had read A Wagner Matinee, sort of the great early story. So I was aware there was quite a bit of material here to work with Cather. But no, I had not anticipated originally writing a whole chapter about Cather. And what happened was I sort of simultaneously fell deeply in love with all of the work. I read basically every word that Cather published, and felt so compelled by it. But at the same time, feeling that this also was a very important chapter of Wagnerism, and it sort of revealed something about Wagner's influence that was different from the kind of European fin de siècle reception of Wagner. Very different emphases, and therefore worth sort of casting more light on.
Yeah.
It was just all the books that I'd seen, and there's a sort of sizable library of books that sort of take up one aspect or another of Wagnerism. Cather was not mentioned very much, and so I felt that this was really worth emphasizing, and really using Cather as an instance, as a model, and sort of delving deep into the Cather question. Sort of, I couldn't give all of these sort of prominent figures this kind of treatment. So I sort of took Cather as a case study in a way, because so many of the other chapters, there's just dozens or sort of hundreds of names kind of moving in and out to the point where might become a little sort of oppressive for the reader. And as in The Rest Is Noise, where I kind of stopped the grand historical parade and zeroed in on first Sibelius and then Benjamin Britten. So those were sort of the two sort of focused sort of single figure chapters in this book. I thought it would be a relief, a respite to stop and just go deep into Cather's world and then sort of return to the sort of mad procession of of Wagnerites in all the different
Just
lands.
for the sake of those who haven't read the book or who haven't read that chapter, can you just say a few words about what it is that the Cather example sheds light on in some way that other figures don't?
Yeah, well, I think Cather, of course, she spent her childhood and sort of early adulthood in Nebraska, in this town of Red Cloud, which I've now visited 3 times, which is a wonderful place. And I've sort of, because I've been working on this book, I've been drawn into this wonderful little world of the Cather people and Cather studies and the community in Red Cloud. And for her at that time, of course, Wagner would have been a very distant figure, and she was not able to see productions of the operas right away. She might have just even been able to hear a couple snippets, sort of, voice and piano excerpts here and there. But the idea of Wagner appealed to her. We can sort of see evidence of this, that she read the stories of the Wagner operas and loved this idea of just kind of the solitary figure in this sort of great open landscape, contesting with great forces, contesting against the elements, and particularly Brunhilde. I think Brunhilde on her rock was just a figure who had this really kind of elemental appeal for Cather. And you see that stance of the solitary figure, the solitary woman against the landscape, replicated in a number of important moments in Cather's output. And then a little later, when she was Pittsburgh and then sort of went to New York, she was in these circles. She was now really seeing the operas in the theater, getting to know singers, becoming fascinated by the backstage culture and by singers' lives. And I think this is another way in which the particular emphases of Cather's approach to Wagner are revealing and valuable and different from sort of what a lot of other authors were focused on. And that is the focus on the singer and on the performance. And I think she just saw everything through the lens of the singer and the performance, because she was just such an avid follower of the theater. So these sort of bigger abstract questions of what Wagner means in his sort of historical context and his philosophical context, were of less interest to her. It was just the reality of Wagner performance, and then these kind of basic mythic archetypes that the singers embodied on stage. And so the Song of the Lark becomes this very deep and very discerning study, I think, of the Wagner singer, or sort of the opera singer more widely, and the power, the status that such singers held in fin de siècle culture, and sort of early 20th century culture. And so the Song of the Lark is very much modeled on Olive Fremstad, one of the great Wagner singers of the day, whose childhood was not unlike Cather's own. She had grown up in Minnesota in a rather rural environment, having moved from Norway as quite young. And so she saw herself in Fremstad and was just fascinated by this classic, I think, type of the Kunstdiva, the singer who is sort of, it's not about technical finery and display. It is about mysteriously embodying the essence of the work and projecting it to the audience on this sort of deeper level. And so, yeah, in this and in a number of other ways, I think Cather, it's just a very different kind of Wagner, different kind of Wagnerism from Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Joyce, Thomas Mann, and all the rest.
So it's American and female, for one thing, which moves into some of those other wonderful chapters that you wrote about Black Wagner and gay Wagner and feminist Wagner, and all of these sort of sub-Wagnerisms, let's say. And I'm wondering about I mean, as some of those, I know those of us who watched you assemble this book over the years from afar and reading little dispatches from Central HQ, and we watched as you discovered the world of sort of Black Wagnerism and explored that, and that I understand was sort of fresh terrain for you, unless I missed my guess. But there's other sections of the book where I felt you kind of synthesizing and organizing things that were already well known. Is that right? That there's that kind of mixture in the book in that way?
Yeah, I mean, the quandary of the Jewish Wagnerite and of Jewish Wagnerism is sort of very well-trod territory, and I had written about it myself, in earlier pieces, and it sort of comes up with Mahler, sort of the case of Mahler and his relationship with Wagner and in various other ways. And so this was familiar terrain, and then there was sort of very wide literature to draw upon and synthesize. I think it still comes as a surprise to many people who hadn't sort of delved into this issue to find that Theodor Herzl was a quite enthusiastic Wagnerite, or that people like Schnitzler, had this complex but sort of ultimately devoted relationship with Wagner, even as they may have satirized in Schnitzler's case, the idea of a Jewish Wagnerite and the kind of contradictions that embodied, and perhaps the self-hatred or the repression that certain such figures could embody. But when it came to African-American Wagnerism, I mean, this was terrain that was sort of not only largely unfamiliar to me, but terrain that just hadn't been much explored at all. And there's just sort of a few other scholars out there on the Afro-Wagnerism beat, and it's not a particularly extensive kind of territory to be explored. It's the Black Wagnerite was not a very numerous species, but still I found, sort of as I delved into it, it was worth delving into more and sort of making more of a topic from it. And so it was a surprise to me to find that ultimately the role of W.E.B. Du Bois, sort of the chief Black Wagnerite of the era, his profile sort of just grew, in the course of sort of putting together that chapter, in particular the chapter on Wagner and race, to the point where I ultimately began and ended with Du Bois, which is probably quite unexpected in terms of what people would be expecting from a treatment of Wagner and race and racism. But there turned out to be a lot there, and along the way, I stumbled across the figure of Lorana Aldridge, who her story was really completely unknown, and I can pat myself on the back for making this little archival discovery at Northwestern University, the papers of Lorana Aldridge's sister, Amanda, filling in what had been just sort of vaguely alluded to, the idea that Lorana Aldridge, the daughter of the great Black Shakespearean actor Ira Aldridge, who was born in New York, who married a Swedish woman, had been cast as a Valkyrie at Bayreuth in 1896, and did not sing because she fell sick. There's one or two sentences in a couple of books that allude to this. I was able to uncover a lot more of the story, including a letter from Cosima Wagner to Lorana Aldridge, written in 1897, which is a sort of a slight eureka moment. And I realized the letter had mislabeled, and I sort of got it and looked at the text of it and saw C. Wagner at the end. And even before I got to looking at the signature, it was obvious that the person writing this letter was a figure of considerable grandeur, just given the phraseology of the letter. So that was just fascinating, the idea that a singer of mixed race could have found a place at Bayreuth and become a friend of the family in 1896, become very close to Wagner and Kosman's daughter Eva, who then went on to marry the noxious racist philosopher Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Just a strange, convoluted, complex story, which I felt was valuable to try to untangle.
Yeah. Well, that brings us to another important chapter and a fully expected chapter in the book, which is about Hitler and the Third Reich. And I don't know about other people, but I kind of, there was an eerie feeling as I progressed through the book of knowing that chapter was waiting for me there, and feeling at once sort of apprehensive and a little resigned to, we're gonna do the Hitler and Wagner dance one more time. And one of the things that I really appreciated about that chapter, if I may say, is that you took a sort of a very calm and soothing tone about it. I felt like you were we got there and you said, yes, okay, we're going to talk about Wagner, about Hitler, and you knew we were going to, but let's, let's take it under control here. And it seemed as though you had on your mind, as you wrote it and as we read it, a sense of, how can we approach this very fraught subject and this very overworked subject with new eyes that won't be a way of whitewashing the history, but at the same time, let's not sensationalize it. That seems to me to be your achievement, and I don't know whether that's what you set out to do, because of course one misreads authors all the time.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I was initially dreading having to write that chapter because I felt I'd already done it, and the chapter on Nazi Germany and the Rest is Noise is heavily concerned with Wagner, to the point where I regretted having gone so deep into it there, because I felt like it sort of took away material from this next book, and I sort of wish I'd known as I was writing it exactly what my next book was going to be. I would have sort of reined it in a bit and set this material aside. So I was just very afraid of having to kind of retread the same ground. And I sort of earlier in the late 1990s, I wrote an essay which was basically concerned with Wagner and the relationship with Hitler, and so it felt like well-worn territory. But I'm very, very happy that if it came across as somewhat different and new, and I certainly wanted to try to find fresh threads in this story, and to structure it, above all, sort of structure it so that when this chapter arrives, it seems like the culmination of something that has been growing over the course of the book. And I sort of thought of it in a kind of narrative way as the slow approach of sort of what is initially glimpsed as kind of this ominous thundercloud kind of on the distant horizon, and it's kind of slowly approaching. And in the earlier chapters, I actually kind of wanted to replicate a certain innocence of the joyous chaos of Wagnerism in those early decades before anyone had any idea where it was all heading. And therefore to have the reader, in a sense, relive this tragedy. And I think it is a tragedy of an artist whose influence was so multivarious and so sort of spectacularly diverse. And then it just contracts, sort of this feeling of sort of Wagner's reputation and image and influence kind of contracting as the decades go by, and the sense that sort of in Nazi Germany, he is kind of nailed down to sort of a certain profile and a certain image, which persists thereafter. And just to relive the awfulness of that process, to which, of course, Wagner himself made a very considerable contribution. It was not something that, it was not this random accident that happened to him. This was to some extent, I think, fated to happen, but at the same time, not to see it as just absolutely inevitable and sort of, carved in stone that of course this 19th century composer would end up influencing this genocidal dictator of the 20th century. I don't think it was at all foreordained. Thomas Mann is just sort of the ultimate model of kind of handling this kind of tricky, complicated question in language that is simultaneously evasive but also acute. And what he said was that Wagner lent himself to his own abuse, and sort of that captures to me very concisely the doubleness of this situation. Wagner is being misappropriated, he's being abused, misused, but he is participating in the process. And it's just a very complicated relationship. And I just wanted to omit none of the complexity and to sort of give no easy answers, and to sort of study every aspect of this, first in that chapter on Wagner and race and racism, and then in the chapter on Nazi Germany. But also, I think that what was particularly new was the degree to which I talked about Nazi popular culture, Nazi American style culture, and how Wagner often did not fit into that Nazi popular culture that Goebbels manipulated so brilliantly. And this was kind of a pivot toward the final chapters, where I do take up the question of American popular culture and Wagner's shadow in that. And there's a kind of disturbing continuity that I wanted to tease out there. And you mentioned superheroes, and so this is one of the themes that I pick up at the end. This mythology of absolute good and absolute evil, the simplification of Wagner's mythic apparatus, which is very complicated and very much not sort of pure good versus pure evil, and sort of what happens when these heroic archetypes and sort of mythological archetypes are perpetuated in popular culture in that way, and therefore leaving us to ask, well, what does that mean in contemporary American culture? What harm has been done by our sort of American hero mythology that has its roots in sort of these older mythologies?
You will have noticed, I'm sure, that the one of the people storming the Capitol the other day was pictured with a great horned helmet, and But I'm curious about this.
Although there was one guy in a Viking helmet,
yeah,
which of course is, I don't know if he's a Wagner listener or not. I kind of doubt it. There are also a number of people in these superhero costumes, and with these patches. The some comic book character, the Predator or the Panther, or sort of something like that, and it's Captain America and sort of these other, they were there too. They haven't sort of drawn quite as much commentary and introspection and analysis as the guy in the ridiculous Votan, whatever that was supposed to be.
We have to leave time for questions. I have one last question for you, which is, you
Punisher. Yes, I see. Someone says Punisher is the
Punisher
character.
I'm curious about your personal place in this, because you did a very interesting thing in this book, which is, instead of an initial chapter where you say, I got interested in this because somebody said, hey, Wagner is blah, blah, and you very cannily kept that till the end of the book, which I thought was a fascinating and very moving choice. And you took some hits for that in some of the reviews. People thought it was disingenuous to hold yourself in reserve till the end, but I thought it was a nice sort of counterpoint to that. And I'm curious about what you have to say about your own personal interactions with Wagner over the years. And, do you consider yourself a Wagnerian, a Wagnerite? Are you a Wagner head, or are you or is this part of some larger plan, and and a universe where, of course, Richard Strauss is the supreme deity and everybody else is just, what's your personal
Brahms is actually the supreme deity for me, but
Brahms is?
Pretty much, yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I have since I was a college student, I've had a little it's up there in the top of my
Oh yeah.
wall there. I've had this sort of icon of Brahms sort of hanging in the highest place in every room that I've ever lived in, like sort of Eastern Orthodox icon in the place of prominence. But never mind. Yeah, well, this was a deliberate and kind of slightly perverse, perhaps, decision that I made. But frankly, I find it cloying and in some ways disingenuous when people always start off books saying, here's this subject that you might not care about, Dutch shipbuilding, but in fact, my grandfather was a Dutch shipbuilder, or, however you can sort of this staged epiphany, which sort of creates this it's designed to create this sort of moment of relatability, is you may not care about the subject, but I care so passionately, and I'm going to sort of bring you along with it. And I don't know. It's just not something that I was just trying to do this in a different way, and I wanted my own personal experience of Wagner to be part of this book, because I think it would be disingenuous to deny it altogether. But I decided to keep it for the very end, which is something I've done in a number of other pieces, sort of New Yorker pieces, several times. I've kind of stepped forward very kind of in this very definite way at the end of the piece, and something about that structure I like. But for me, it was just very logical to sort of, having gone through everyone else's sort of warped kind of personal perspective on Wagner, to sort of reveal my own and to examine my own kind of ambivalence, but not to make too much out of it. I just feel like it would have, to sort of stage at the beginning, just would have just made my rather ordinary kind of sort of personal tussle with Wagner over the years sort of give it too much significance. So instead, it's a kind of this personal epilogue. And yeah, I suppose I'm a Wagnerite. There are just sort of a number of composers who mean a great deal to me, whom I listen to all the time. Possibly Brahms, chief among them, but it could be Bach, it could be Schubert. I don't know. I guess I would certainly say that I'm a Wagnerism-Ite, in that I'm just absolutely riveted, by this question of how Wagner has been received by all these other people, and I find every aspect of that just sort of endlessly hypnotizing and fascinating. But ultimately, when I sort of go back to Wagner as a listener, it does feel sort of a bit more ordinary at this point, or at least I'm sort of now on the other side of this immersion, and I'm kind of reverting to just sort of a more, not casual, but sort of not kind of sort of fully fanatical relationship, which sort of what happened. Like, I went through this with Bob Dylan. I became utterly obsessed by Bob Dylan at a certain point, and I wrote this article for the New Yorker, and I just could not stop talking about Dylan for a number of years, and just driving everyone around me crazy. And now it's reverted to just kind of, I'm just a Dylan fan, but it just doesn't obsess me every single day of my life, and so that's what Wagner is perhaps coming now for me as well.
Is there a new fanaticism on the horizon?
Not yet. I have really vague ideas for another book, but it wouldn't be focused on a single figure.
Got it.
Something more.
So I'm keeping an eye on the clock, because I know we were supposed to take questions, and I don't know, Terry, what's the
Okay. I should be on now. You're hearing me? I can see that. I should have video on too, but I doesn't appear to have video. I was going to read a couple. I've got a couple questions out here from some of our members. From Robin McDuff, I don't know whether she's in Santa Cruz or Hawaii right now, but she says, it sounds like Wagner book is the perfect entry into The Rest is Noise. How Wagnerian of you to write it in that order. If someone hasn't read either, would you agree that order might lead to a richer understanding of the story told in The Rest is Noise? Did you hear that?
Possibly, yes, because I mean, the Restless Noise begins kind of in the middle of this drama of fin de siècle culture and Wagnerian culture, so it will feel sort of very much like a continuation, and maybe to some extent a kind of replication of a lot of the themes of the second part of the book, sort of Wagner after 1900. But there's a lot else going on in that book when I'm talking about the influence of American popular music or sort of, all these different aspects of 20th century music that really don't fit at all into a Wagnerian template. But yeah, I certainly, I mean, Wagnerism is a longer book and a denser book, and the rest is noise might sort of go down a little more easily if you wanted to sort of
quite possibly
take gradual steps into the abyss of, Alex Ross obsessions. But I don't know if there's any one right way to do it.
Yeah, well, you do it the way you do it, and people can interpret it however they want. Got a question here from Kirk Davis in Huntington Beach. I'm thinking he's probably a Southern California Wagner Society member. Thanks for joining us. Is there any composer of the last 50 years that might, in the future, have some global impact as Wagner did? Thank you, Kirk.
You said of the last 50 years?
50, yes, 50.
Well, in classical music, I would have to say no. I mean, we're not seeing the scope of influence of classical composers sort of anywhere sort of in the same realm as what happened with Wagner, because classical composers themselves do not have the exalted and kind of central status that they did at the beginning of the 20th century or at the end of the 19th century. And there just was this great religion of art and deification of the artist in ways both good and ill in the later 19th century. It happened also with Tolstoy and Ibsen and a number of other figures. And I think in no medium are we giving artists this kind of grandiose profile. So even in popular music, I mean, there are popular artists who are universally recognized. Have they caused shifts in the very kind of stylistic evolution of other art forms, or helped to cause? A much better way to put it, as Wagner did say with symbolism and early modernism. I don't even think that's happening. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are, Joshua, but I think this is an epiphenomenon of the bourgeois 19th century and the kind of exaltation of art at the end of the 19th century.
That's all true, but I would expand your no even further. I mean, Kirk says, if there been any composer of the last 50 years that have had the global impact that Wagner did, and one of the things that your book shows is there haven't been any classical composers of the last 500 years that have had the same kind of global impact. I mean, I think if I'm remembering this right, you mentioned people like Monteverdi or Beethoven or Stravinsky who have had maybe comparable influence within the world of music history, but none of them ever jumped lanes the way Wagner did, and he's really sui generis in that way in the history of European music, I think.
Yeah, I think just in the sense of sort of causing this wave which radiates outward and is visible in the other art forms. You do not see that, say, with Bach or Beethoven, as obviously both of those composers have been cited innumerable times in other art forms and books, depicted in paintings, heard in movies, et cetera. But I possibly with the exception of Beethoven, I just don't have the sense of these sort of movements arising, and really kind of what happened with Beethoven in music is kind of an echo of what had already happened with sort of romanticism in literature, in painting, and it's certainly I don't feel as though it's the other way around.
Okay. I've got one from one of my folks, Hannes Vogel. Your book masterfully dissects the influences by Wagner on the non-musical phenomena. But to what extent, let's see, the text over is text, but to what extent do you feel like his music alone wielded influence in these areas without their knowledge or understanding of his prose writing or even the synopsis of his operas?
Oh yeah, sure. I think it had a very powerful and sizable influence in the, and it comes in several different forms as sort of Wagnerism and the other art forms comes. You have sort of the obvious Wagner imitation, sort of all of the operas that attempt to sort of create a kind of ring cycle type situation about sort of Breton legends or Catalan legends or whatever it is, and that's sort of very obvious kind of replication. And then in a deeper and kind of more substantial way, you see Schoenberg, especially, but also I think in a much more oblique way, Stravinsky, reacting to the tension in tonality that Wagner heightened, especially in Tristan, and Schoenberg very directly depicted himself as being the culmination, the completion, sort of the final logical consequence of this growing tension, this growing instability in harmony that is felt in Tristan. And he would have staged it, that famous Scandal concert in 1913. It would have begun with the Tristan prelude, and then went on to sort of Mahler and Semlinsky, and then Schoenberg and his own students. It was a historical panorama of sort of the emergence of atonality, as it happened to the Wagner was cut for time reasons, and then the whole concert came prematurely to a halt when this riot was set off. But this is kind of the historical narrative that Schoenberg told around himself, and I think there's a reality to it. It isn't just sort of this fiction that Schoenberg invented. Even if with Wagner, you do always return to the stable tonal ground in the end, and I don't feel really that Wagner was pushing harmony to the breaking point deliberately, and that if he lived longer, he might have sort of gone over the threshold. I think it's just that tension between consonance and dissonance was one that he valued for dramatic reasons. And in fact, when he heard some of Liszt's late piano pieces, in which we really are very much at the border of atonality, if not going over the border, he thought Liszt had lost his mind. So he was not really, I think, on board with the inherent historical tendency of the material, that Schoenberg and Adorno perceived in his work, personally himself.
There's a virtuosic moment in Richard Taruskin's 6-volume history of Western music, where he splices the Tristan chord into Mozart's Rondo a la Turque. Showing my age here. Mozart's Rondo a la Turque, and it fits right in, as a way of saying, his tonal desperado qualities are overstated. He you can certainly read the Tristan chord as being part of this A minor progression. And
then Richard Strauss created that sort of condensed version of Tristan and Isolde, which sort of lasts just a few bars, and you hear the very beginning, and then you hear this at the very end, and everything else in the middle is cut out. But it works beautifully.
I've got one query from Rick Bogard. Would you compare Wagner's lane jumping in influence with Shakespeare's? Though I don't think they had lanes in Shakespeare's days.
Well, I say at the beginning, I say that, and I'm very far from being the first to say this, that there is an aspect to Wagner which seems Shakespearean in breadth, in terms of this universality of influence, and this sort of this endless epic of translation and reinterpretation. And you can see it perhaps also with Aeschylus, Dante, Cervantes, sort of certain select figures seem to sort of acquire this kind of infinite replicability. And yet I feel ultimately, as I say in the beginning, sort of Wagner in some way falls short, or has so far fallen short of this kind of universality, because perhaps not enough time's gone by. Perhaps it is a question of Wagner's very obvious flaws, and I think the all too copious documentation of what Wagner himself was thinking end up limiting this universality. And I think it's the sort of great kind of advantage that Shakespeare has in terms of this process of becoming universal, is that we know basically nothing about what Shakespeare himself thought. You know, if we had a daily diary of Shakespeare's wife, we might there might be all kinds of horrifying information surfacing that would really kind of injure our conception of what's going on in Shakespeare. But fortunately for him, there's almost nothing.
Okay. Well, from John Bing, to what extent can Wagner's anti-Semitism be attributed in part to professional jealousy of the success of W.E.B, Meyerbeer, and Offenbach? Well, yeah. What's he jealous of? Well, their success, yeah, maybe, but he certainly is the one we hear more.
Yeah, I think it's much deeper than that. You know, this was sort of the first real jumping off point for his public anti-Semitism, and undoubtedly he did feel enormous jealousy, especially of Meyerbeer, when he went to Paris and saw Le Prophète immediately in the wake of his own having to be losing his position in Dresden and having to go into exile. But of course, anti-Semitism had a deep history, which was sort of feeding into sort of Wagner's own conceptions and own rhetoric, and he was just sort of echoing a lot of rhetoric that already existed. But it just compounded from there. And when he republishes Jewishness in Music,
yeah.
He has sort of an entirely new set of Jewish enemies in mind. And Meyerbeer really obviously no longer concerns him. It's the journalists that concern him. It's Hanslick. And so the enemies have changed. The kind of circumstances, sort of specific circumstances of Wagner becoming enraged have changed, but the prejudice is the same. And the mechanism, the psychological mechanism is the same, and the historical circumstances are just becoming more and more powerful. And so, yeah, it just sort of goes much deeper than those specific issues with Meyerbeer and Mendelssohn.
Okay, well, I got a comment here from John Mastrogiovanni, our co-host here today. He's saying, I would say, while we speak to Wagnerism, the superhero concept, like the 22 movies of the Marvel universe, would be a similar impact. And if we rewind 30 years to the original Star Wars, maybe the movement you refer to. So that's from John Mastrogiovanni. I was trying to lure him over to Q&A so I could unmute him, but he's over there. I thought I would ask you about the superhero commentary made by Alex. So I'm trying to stitch this all together.
Yeah, so what was the first part again? In terms of rewinding?
Would you like to expound on the notion of the superhero concept you mentioned at the beginning, speaking to Wagnerism? The superhero concept, like the 22 movies, so on and so forth. Let me see if I can get him to come in here live. Would you like to answer this question live? No, that's not seeming to work.
Well, I think I have the gist of it.
Yeah, okay, go.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question I take up especially in the very end of the book, in the final chapter. because you see these themes, these motifs, these archetypes being replicated. The same kinds of figures and themes all through the Wagner operas. The young hero discovering his miraculous abilities. Sort of these scenes like the broken sword, sort of the sword being discovered, sort of pulled from the tree, the ring of power. Wagner invented none of these, or very few of these. He did actually invent the ring of power. They already existed, but he charged them, he modernized them in a very startling way, and kind of propelled them back out into the mainstream of culture in a way that sort of this sort of mythological narrative became very, very prominent, and sort of has just sort of kept being replicated from generation to generation. So we get this American version of it. And so very often Wagner is not a direct influence on this work, but it's a relationship, it's a resemblance that I think is sort of important to comment on, and sort of to create a sort of big historical context for. In the case of The Lord of the Rings, it is a very direct influence, since Tolkien knew his Wagner quite well. And what's important to think about is what happens when these mythic stories are simplified and popularized and politicized. And when you have this narrative of pure good against pure evil being used as a model, as a metaphor for contemporary political struggles, I think it becomes very, very dangerous. And we see in Nazi Germany, or before Nazi Germany, sort of even in sort of Wilhelmine Germany, Siegfried being turned into this pure German hero in a way that he is not, in Wagner. Siegfried is a failed hero. Wotan is a failed god. It's this, there is no good, pure good and good evil, in pure good and pure evil in Wagner, especially in The Ring. Alberic has his admirable qualities, and so when those complexities are dropped aside, and I'm really repeating here a thesis put forward by the German sociologist Herfried Münkler about the simplification of myth. This is where it becomes dangerous, and this is what I think we need to do as Americans, to look at our own popular culture and see its political ramifications. So it's sort of something that I'm kind of encouraging at the end of the book. By the way, Münkler has written a new book, if any of you know his work, coming out in Germany in the spring, called Marx, Wagner, Nietzsche, which sounds like will be high on my reading list.
Boy,
Not leaving anyone out, is he?
that's rough sledding. I mean, oh goodness. Okay, I've got an anonymous attendee, famous Anonimo. Since finishing the book and having to make necessary cuts, is there any anecdote or topic that you wish you could have kept in the book that you might like to share with us today?
Oh yeah, I mean, there was a lot of stuff that I cut out, which I was just very much in love with. And there's other decadent, third-rate French novels that I read that I would have loved to have got into in detail, and sort of scenes of lesbian lovemaking in the seats and Bayreuth, all this kind of stuff. And what I realized with my editor's encouragements as he looked over the drafts of the book, we just can't have too much of this. where the reader begins to be. I mean, I think there already is probably too much of it in the final version. I will say, I'll pick out one example, which is something I did not know about at all, to my own embarrassment, until I received an email from a Dutch reader the other day, telling me about Louis Couperus's story, The Binoculars, or sort of the looking glass. And this is a short story, which I was able to find a translation of, which came out around 1900, about a young man who goes to a performance of Valkyria and is swept away by it and sort of enters this state of demented enthusiasm. He has this very heavy set of binoculars that he bought for the performance. And he becomes obsessed with the idea, as he's setting up in the balcony, what would happen if he threw these binoculars down onto the bald head of a man sitting in the orchestra seats below. And he's kind of writhing in his seat, trying to contain this homicidal impulse. And he eventually succeeds in containing this impulse, despite emitting these kind of strangulated cries, and goes away. And he leaves the binoculars behind him in the seat. Then years later, he comes back to see Valkyria again in the same place. And he's at in the coat room, and someone, the attendant says, "Would you like to rent these binoculars?" It is the same set of binoculars that were sort of left behind and then became part of the opera house's collection. And he goes to his seat, the same impulse comes to him, and this time he does not succeed in resisting it. The binoculars fall, they implode the brain of the man below him, who dies instantly. And that's the end of the story.
Oh, wow.
And I'm very frustrated. I was not able to.
That'll put me off.
Might even try to squeeze it into the paperback edition, because it would fit very neatly into the little section I have in my book devoted to satanic Wagnerism, about sort of these diabolical impulses that enter into people when they listen to Wagner. So that's that.
Yeah. I won't be buying orchestra seats.
Just check upward to make sure that.
Well, yeah. No, I wouldn't give up my seats for anything. One from Lisa Hirsch. I can only imagine the enormous amount of research you did and the notes accumulated for this book. I mean, it probably is mind-boggling. How did you go about teasing out the themes and organizing the book?
Oh, that was just the struggle year after year. Hi, Lisa. Thanks for the question. Yeah, it was just this mountain of material. I think everyone who writes a book, a big historical book, especially that relies on a lot of research, is that you have these mounds of raw material, and you're trying to pull a narrative from them in a way that will really sort of carry the reader along in what seems to be a sort of logical and purposeful fashion, without letting go of too much of this variegated material that you've accumulated, some of which no one else may have seen before, and you just desperately want to preserve it and sort of put it out into the world, but not in a way that just feels like you're just kind of, it's like this sort of this kind of conveyor belt of oddities sort of going by you. And so that was the struggle. And I must credit my editor, Eric Chinsky, for participating in this struggle and in attempting to reason with me and restrain me and just saying, look, the binoculars story, if I'd been so fortunate as to find the binoculars story, perhaps Eric would have told me it's just not, it just feels spurious, as kind of learned and interesting as it is, and you're gonna have to drop it. And it's just so fundamentally difficult, because on the one hand you want to have a strong, coherent, orderly narrative, but also, having spent so much time with this material, you do want to kind of preserve it and sort of put it out there for the sake of so many different readers who might kind of find one use or another for it, and sort of take it and sort of, move it in some new direction. And at a certain point, I did face the kind of crossroads where, is this really going to be a much more kind of controlled and selective narrative, or is it really going to be much more sprawling and comprehensive and perhaps ultimately a bit wearisome? And I did kind of take that sort of second turn, and I thought it was just actually necessary to do that because this book was attempting to do something that no one had actually really tried to do before. And no one had tried to pull all these different varieties of Wagnerism into one book. There have been so many brilliant studies of one aspect or another, but there's no one book that really tried to encompass all of this. And so I thought it was worth trying, and sort of worth trying to sort of bring as much into the picture absolutely as possible. And just sort of put it out there and sort of let people do with it what they will and be interested in it or be bored by it, but this was the journey that I'd taken, and I sort of had to sort of stick with it to the end. I should mention as a asterisk to that claim of there being no other book, there is Timothée Picard's Dictionnaire encyclopédique Wagner, which is 2,500 pages long, and this just pretty much everything is in here, everything having to do with Wagner as well as everything having to do with Wagnerism. So it's a magnificent book. Although I think even I may have found a few things that do not make it into the Dictionnaire encyclopédique, but it's for anyone who reads French and is devoted to Wagner, I recommend it very highly. It's an endlessly valuable resource.
I have a quick question from Yasmin Solfagari, who's joining us from Berlin. And Yasmin is a director and an author and a teacher and a good friend of our society and the Southern California Society. She asked, you have certain fixed hours in a day you took for writing. You take time slots like some weeks and then pause? Or is it just all consuming?
No. No, and reading about Willa Cather for one, or Thomas Mann, and they with absolutely strict regularity, sort of they rise at 6 in the morning or 7 in the morning and write for 3 or 4 hours and sort of write 1,000 words or however many words it is. Then they take the rest of the day to go for walks and answer correspondence and have a nice dinner. So how I wish I could adopt such a routine, but it's really the opposite. It's just sort of hours of time being wasted and sort of activity which seems to kind of bear some relationship to work, but which is not actual writing and production of words on a page, and sort of a number of hours go by, and then I have this nagging sense that the entire day will be wasted unless I produce something, and so sort of there's this burst of activity at 3 o'clock or so. When I was much younger, I used to write at night, so at least I've abandoned that. But yeah, it's very irregular. But what tends to happen is, I do just ultimately get deep into some aspect of the project, and there's sort of several weeks of sort of very intense labor where I really am kind of making my way through a chapter, or if it's just a longer essay for the New Yorker. I need to create this period of time where I just sort of clear everything else away and feel as though I can just kind of look at this and nothing but. And it worked out fairly well with the New Yorker, where I was able to sort of carve out these periods in between my New Yorker work where it was kind of all Wagner all the time. And then I would break off and sort of go back to the New Yorker. And I think having those breaks and sort of being able to sort of come back and sort of pick up the thread, sort of look back at what I'd done. I'm not one of those people who can sort of rent a cabin in the woods and sort of write a whole book in 6 months. I think I would just completely lose my mind. It does need to be sort of broken up into these kind of smaller, shorter periods of intense activity, at least for me. I don't know how you feel, Joshua. You may be.
I haven't written a book, so I was going to say, you know, Catherine and Thomas Mann sound like they have it under control, but my man Anthony Trollope, you know, got up and wrote 4 hours every day and then went off to a full-time day job. So,
Well,
you know.
yeah. That's
Lisa says, I knew Joshua was about to say that, and she was right.
Yeah, you got that right. She doesn't miss a beat on anything. Well, I think we've kind of finished up all the questions. I don't see any new things here. Anything from you, Joshua, to
No,
add?
I think we covered the beat, and it was
Yeah,
a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Yes, and I'm really delighted to have both of you with us for this talk. And thank you very much for opening our Wagner year of 2021 in such an auspicious manner. This is a chat I've wanted to have for a long time, so I'm now satisfied. For the time being, until about 5 o'clock tonight. Yeah. So thank you very much for being with us, gentlemen. It's been a great afternoon. We had our largest audience ever. So you are really rock stars of a higher order. Even better than the Marvel superheroes, I think. But so anyway, we do have 2 more talks scheduled. So I think Emma's going to put up a slide now. Catherine Sire, who's tuned in today. Catherine, hi.
Hello.
Great to have you with us. She's going to give the next talk on Saturday, February 20th on Wagner's Beethoven essay of 1870. And then in March, we're going to have somebody who hasn't been with us for a while, Jeffrey Buller, from down in Florida, is going to talk about how and why Wagner uses images of sleep in The Ring. So those are 2 great talks coming up. We have more percolating in the background. Everybody go out and get this book and start reading on it. I actually, you know, I have a lot of little Post-it notes in mine. I just have been in a funk all week long and haven't been able to pick it up and read it. It would be great that if I could, but I wasn't able to. So thank you very much for joining us, and for everyone else who's out there, non-members, join your local Wagner Society, pay your dues. That's what funds all of this. That was my one commercial aspect today. We can't do it without, we need money. We all know Wagner was running around begging for money all the time. So this is just our little infomercial here. Pay your dues if you haven't already. If you have, thank you. If you're not a member of Wagner Society, join one and support this, this cause and our obsession, our mutual obsession. So with that, I'm going to say bye-bye, and I'm going to go ahead and close the meeting then, and thank everybody. I think that when I leave, I don't know if the speakers still stay. So if this is an abrupt bye-bye, I'm sorry. But
thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I'm going to say, Level, thank you for joining us. I'll email you, have your people call my people. Bye-bye.